Ms. Sherrill is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Austin, General Milley, General McKenzie. I have quite a few questions, and some I may have to submit for the record, because I think it's important to start with this and somewhat echo my Republican colleagues' opening. We've continued to see attacks on our democracy and our values from members representing what, at least historically, would have been the extreme elements of the Republican Party. Attacks including, but not limited to, the horrible attack on our Capitol and our Congress on January 6th. And one of the cornerstones of our democracy and our government is civilian, not military, rule. This is sacrosanct to those of us who've worn the uniform. And, judging from the attacks by some members of this committee, poorly understood by those who have not. I have concerns about how the NEO was executed, but I must applaud all of you for scrupulously ensuring our civilian government remained the decision-making authority as you continued to provide your best military advice, even when, at times, your advice differed from the decisions made. Thank you. I'd like to now turn to some questions that I have related to the timeline of events. So, as I understand it, in February of 2020, President Trump made an agreement with the Taliban to withdraw U.S. troops by May 1st, 2021, in exchange for several conditions, including a halt to attacks against U.S. forces and cutting ties with Al-Qaeda. By the time he left office, President Trump had drawn down forces to 2,500 and publicly indicated his intent to complete the withdrawal if he had been reelected. And I think, Chairman Milley, you mentioned the 10 November 2020 withdrawal of troops by 15 January 2020, which was rescinded, and then the 17 November 2020 drawdown to 2,500 by 19 January. Is that correct?
It was a memo dated 11 November, 2 days after Secretary Esper was fired. And then on the 17th, it was rescinded. The first memo said go to 0. The second one said go to 2,500.
Thank you. And so were you consulted on the decisions to open negotiations solely with the Taliban to the exclusion of the Afghan government, General?
Very, very late in the game, like days before the signing.
And General Milley, were there concrete plans for withdrawal from the previous administration that were shared and developed with military leadership?
Well, we were 12,600 on the day that the Doha agreement was 12,600 U.S. military in Afghanistan when the Doha agreement was signed. Part of that agreement was to go to 8,500 within, I think it was 135 days. I'd have to go back to the agreement and look at it. And then it was to bring down all the U.S. military, NATO, contractors, close all the bases by 1 May. So it was an agreement signed by our government. We dutifully executed a deliberate drawdown over time from February of 20 all the way through based on a set of milestones. So we did withdraw, and we had a plan to withdraw.
Did any of those plans include plans to evacuate civilian American personnel, citizens, and SIV holders?
Yes, General McKenzie and CENTCOM did develop NEO plans, but not like the large SIV holders and lots of American citizens. It was primarily the embassy and their personnel. But I'd defer to Frank McKenzie to talk about the details of the NEO plans at that time.
General McKenzie.
So we hold a NEO plan for every country in the Central Command region. So yes, we had a plan to bring out mainly American citizens and people associated with the embassy. Planning later began to encompass the larger population, the at-risk Afghan population, the SIV population. But initially, like every other plan, it's centered on American citizens and their families.
And when you say the planning later grew to include that, what is the time frame for when you began to include SIV?
No later than the early spring of this year.
So under this administration?
Yes.
And General Milley, in your testimony to the SASC yesterday, you testified that the Trump administration's plans had not been developed via a robust interagency process. How closely were you and other senior military leaders consulted on President Trump's plans as they were developed?
I wasn't consulted on the 11 November order that I received. That's why I went over to the White House with Acting Secretary Miller and the White House Chief of Staff Kash Patel to discuss that order. So I wasn't consulted on it.
Thank you, and my time's expired. I'll submit the rest of my questions for the record.